Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Hello and welcome to Mains QIP Program 2020. A series of video lectures where we are going to learn the art and skill of mains answer writing, which is the main determining factor behind the selection and the final rank. Now, in this particular video, we are going to take up a question from Geography, Environment, Ecology, Biodiversity and Disaster Management topic. And we are going to deal with a lot of issues which students normally face as far as answer writing is concerned. So let us now set the expectations right at the outset. Now in this discussion, we are going to first discuss why we have taken this particular question. And those will be based on two important parameters: past UPSC questions and its importance from the perspective of Mains 2020. Then we are going to discuss how to decode a question, and mainly with respect to the parts and the demands of the question. Then we are going to discuss the basic concepts which shall be needed to answer this particular question. Then we are going to discuss the structure of an answer, which is very important, which students often ignore. And then obviously we are going to discuss the sample answer, and finally we will evaluate the sample answer on the parameters which we have chosen. Now the question which we have taken for today's discussion is: UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. Critically analyze the statement focusing on outcomes of Madrid Conference. Now the question is of 15 marks and it needs to be answered in 250 words. Now if you closely read the syllabus of mains examination, you will find the matters dealing with the climate change appearing in both GS paper 1 and paper 3. For example, in GS paper 1, a line in the syllabus says changes in critical geographical features. Obviously these changes can be attributed to climate change as well. And similarly in GS paper 3, it talks about conservation, environmental pollution, and these two matters obviously contribute to climate change. So you can see a similar question can be asked both in GS 1 and GS paper 3. Also, UPSC has asked question in 2017 which asked: climate change is a global problem. How India will be affected by climate change? How Himalayan and coastal states of India will be affected by climate change? So you can see that this question has one statement and two questions along with it. Now the second aspect of the question is its current relevance, and a lot of pessimism has cropped up in the field of climate action because negotiations at UN Climate Summit in Madrid failed as the 2-week-long meeting ended without a crucial agreement on global carbon market rules of Paris Agreement. We will discuss this matter in detail later on, but the question, if you see, focuses on this news headline which we have taken, because the question is about UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. Because the Madrid conference also, just like the past conferences, was not able to arrive at a consensus as to how we are going to deal the climate change. Now, as far as the coverage of this topic is concerned, if you are keeping in touch with our material, which is Daily News Simplified and Focus, this topic has been covered in detail in both of them. As far as DNS is concerned, you can see that in DNS dated 16th of December 2019, this matter was discussed in detail. Similarly, in the Focus of January month, all the perspectives dealing with the Conference of Parties 25 were dealt with in detail. So by keeping a regular touch with the current affairs, you can easily prepare this topic. So now comes decoding a question and how to decode the question. Now you might wonder that if the question is written directly over there, why is there a need to decode the question? Now you can trust us on this. In our vast experience at Rouse IAS, we have consistently seen a common problem as far as answering a question is required. And that is not the lack of knowledge, but more often than not, students are not able to understand the question properly, because just like any other skill, understanding or decoding a question comes from practice. And that is very easy, and you will see how. So whenever you see a question, two things need to be done. First thing is identification of the parts of the question. So in this case, if you read the question along, you will see UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. That is one statement. There is no question which needs to be answered. But all those questions which contain statements like these need substantiation. And then the next part is critically analyze this statement focusing on outcomes of Madrid Conference. And this is the question. And this is a very common format as far as UPSC mains examination is concerned. A statement followed by a question. Now when we'll answer the question, we will understand how to address both statement as well as the actual question. Now after you have identified the parts, next important task is to identify the key terms hidden inside the question. And for that, you should have your pen ready. And as you read the question, you need to underline along with that. So for example, the question is UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. So the first key term is UN climate talks are failing. That is one important key term. Now next important key term is outcomes of the Madrid Conference, which is not only very important from the perspective of 2020 mains, but at the same time it is also a very recent event and an important one. But these two terms obviously don't mean anything unless and until you understand what UPSC wants you to do. And that comes from critically analyze. So you have to critically analyze this statement that UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. And you have to do that by laying special emphasis on the outcomes of the Madrid Conference. Now simultaneously, it is very important to understand the meaning of the term critically analyze. And terms like critically analyze, discuss, enumerate, analyze have differences among them. And those differences are not minor. For example, critically analyze means that you have to give your final verdict as to what are the pros and cons of the statement. And we will see later on how we do that. So now you can understand that decoding a question is not only important, but it is also very easy. And by practicing answer writing for few days, you can become very quick at it. Now we will move on to the basic concepts which will be needed to answer this question. Although we can discuss these concepts later on while we write answers, but then it might divert the attention. So we thought it would be better to succinctly discuss all these concepts right here. So whenever you see a question dealing with the climate talks or climate change, it is important that you have few data ready with you. And the most reliable source which you can refer is that of IPCC reports. IPCC, that is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, regularly comes with various reports. For example, you can see IPCC's special report on impact of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So whenever you quote reports of IPCC as far as climate change is concerned, not only your answer gets credibility, but it also adds a lot of value which reflects in marks. Now there are various other reports of IPCC as well which you can use depending upon the kind of question, and this is just for example purpose. Now as far as concepts are concerned, you need to understand the tools which can be utilized, which global community wants to adopt to counter the impact of climate change, and they are market and non-market mechanisms, enhanced action, compensation for loss and damage. If you don't understand these terms, don't worry, we'll make you understand. When Paris climate deal was being finalized, the measures like these were not agreed upon, and hence they were left on future climate talks to be finalized. And 5 years later, we find that agreement on none of them have been arrived by the global community. And hence, we talk about failure of UN climate talks. So let's start the discussion with understanding market and non-market mechanisms for carbon credits. Now, market and non-market mechanisms have been provided in the Article 6 of the Paris Climate Deal. And Article 6 deals with mitigation of climate change, which means reduction in the impact which the greenhouse gases are making by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you have understood the Paris Climate Deal, you know that countries all across the world have promised to cut down their greenhouse gas emissions, and those emission cuts are known by NDCs or nationally determined contributions, which can be seen in orange color boxes here. So if country A has promised NDC of this much amount, which means that country A is going to cut down its greenhouse gases emission by this much amount. And similarly, the country B has also promised to cut down the emissions more than country A, as you can see. But let's say after 10 years, country A has been able to perform better and it was able to cut down more than what it promised. As you can see, this much amount extra has been cut down in country A's emissions because of its efforts. Whereas country B took some efforts, but its emission cuts were not as great as it promised, and hence country B is far away from its target. But since Paris Climate Deal is binding, which means that if you have promised this much amount of emission cut, you need to attain that by a certain year, country B needs to take some steps. And hence, what market mechanism does is that it provides for the transfer of these carbon credits, which means the extra efforts which you have put from one country to that of another. So as you can see, country A's effort has been shown with the green color indicating the right action, whereas the country's B effort has been shown to be with the red color, which means deficit of action. So what market mechanism does is that it provides for the transfer of these credits from one country to another so that each country meets its own targets. At the same time, some countries can earn the revenue out of it. So as you can see, country A has transferred its extra credit to country B. In the target year, country A has its target and achievement balanced, and the country B at the same time has its targets and achievements balanced. Now it was expected that the rules for this transfer of the credits and the pricing on which this transfer shall be carried out will be finalized. But there was no agreement on that. Now since the focus of this video is on answer writing, we shall not go into details of such transfers. But to understand all these concepts in a greater detail, you can watch our QIP program or you can watch our DNS videos to understand the finer details of these concepts. But the bottom line is that there was no agreement on market and non-market mechanisms dealt in Article 6 of Paris Climate Deal. Now, next important concept is enhanced action. Now, enhanced action means that whatever you have promised, you need to step up your efforts. Because if we take into account the nationally determined contributions of all the countries, those efforts will not be enough to contain the climate change within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to illustrate this, we have taken a graph from IPCC website, which shows on the y-axis the temperature change from pre-industrial level, and on the x-axis we have time. And as you can see, in 2017, the global warming was already 1 degree more than pre-industrial level, and our target is to contain it within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can see that we only have 0.5 degrees Celsius of space left. So if we extrapolate the temperature change, keeping into account the current level of emissions, we are going to have more than 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of temperature change by the end of 2100, which means after 80 years. But if we take into account the actions which the governments have promised across the world, and if we assume that they are able to abide by those actions, then the temperature change will be less than 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. But again, that will not be enough to restrict the temperature change below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as you can see with this yellow line. And hence, in order to limit the temperature change below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the line shown in the black color, all the countries across the world are needed to ramp up their NDCs, or they need to increase their commitment to climate action, and that is enhanced action. And it was believed that at Madrid there will be some agreement or at least some consensus on how to approach this enhanced action. But a lot of countries, including China and India, did not agree to any aspect of enhanced action, citing the examples of developed countries, because what China and India believe is that first all the countries should at least come clean on whatever they have promised, and then we can talk about increasing the commitments. But there are other issues as well, and again they have been discussed in detail in our QIP videos as well as in our DNS. And the final concept which is needed to understand the failure of these UN climate talks is compensation for loss and damage. Now, compensation for loss and damage talks about the historical contribution of the developed countries towards climate change. Now, you understand that most of the greenhouse gas emissions comes from industrial development. And since developed countries are the one in which the industrialization took place quite early, they are responsible for maximum historical emissions. But if you analyze the impacts of global warming in the form of climate change, the maximum loss and damage is being suffered in developing nations. Be it impact of erratic weather on agriculture or increasing frequency of natural disaster, you can consider any aspect of climate change and you will find out that developing countries are the ones which are most affected. And hence, developing nations want liability to be fixed on developed nations and finalize a mechanism for compensation for the acts which they have done and the profits which they have derived from industrialization. Now, obviously, you can see that there could not be any agreement on either the financial or the technological aspect of climate change mitigation and such transfers to developing nations. So these are the three important tools, if utilized properly, can aid our fight against climate change. And it was expected that Madrid would provide a platform on which most nations will evolve consensus, but that could not happen. And hence we talk about the failure of the climate talks to address the urgency of the crisis. Now comes the actual answer writing part. And in that, answer structure is very important. Because just like any other parcel which you receive on your birthday, your answer is like a package which consists of outer packaging, which is introduction, the real stuff inside, which is the body, and the actual note which you give inside the gift, which is conclusion. And just like a perfect gift, all three components play an important role in leaving an impression. Now, as far as introduction is concerned, it is important because, as we have discussed, it is the packaging of your answer and it is also the introduction line or the first line of your answer which the evaluator is going to read. And if you get your introduction right, it can show the evaluator that you are aware of the topic or not. So, introduction is very important. Now, as far as introduction to any particular question is concerned, it can be of various types. But broadly, two things need to be kept in mind. The introduction should be relevant to the key terms. So as we have identified in this particular question, the key terms are UN climate talks are failing and there is an urgency and also the outcomes of Madrid Conference. So you have the freedom to trade along either three of these directions. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that introduction should not be totally irrelevant to the main body. The best introduction is one which makes way for the body part of the answer. So in this case, since we are talking about the failure to address the urgency of the crisis, we can start our introduction by establishing the urgency either by data or by example. As we have discussed, data can be from any of the international organizations. And as far as example is concerned, you can write about increasing frequency of natural disasters due to climate change impact. Now then comes the body part, and you can easily visualize that the body parts need to answer two things. Show that the UN climate talks are failing, and you can do that by demonstrating that Madrid Conference failed to achieve consensus on most critical issues of climate action. And finally comes the conclusion part. And just like introduction, conclusion can also be of various types. It can either show a way forward. It can be an ideal case study. For example, in this case, you can show the example of European Union, which has devised its own climate action after it lost hope from UNFCCC. Or you can also take sides in special cases. For example, in this case, the question is critically analyzed. And hence, a conclusion to this part can also be about demonstrating or substantiating that yes, the failure is taking place and we need to be serious about that. And similarly, we have chosen the substantiation of the question statement in this case. Let us now discuss the answer. So this is the introduction of the sample answer which you will find in the solution booklet as well. So the introduction in our sample answer starts with climate change is one of the most compelling global challenges. The IPCC special report informed that it is still possible to limit the climate change to 1.5 degree if and only if there are rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. So what you have done in introduction, that you have given a data and you have shown that it is possible to achieve this data if proper action is taken. And then in the body part, we are talking about the actions which are needed. So you can see that the introduction not only informs you about the current situation, but it also sets the tone for the body part as far as the main agenda of the Madrid Conference is concerned. So the body part starts with, in this regard, there were high expectations from Madrid Conference, but it ended in failure. As we have already discussed, there were a lot of hopes related to Article 6, compensation for loss and damage, and enhanced actions. Now, an important ingredient of answer writing is practice, because whenever you use a key term, it is always important to define it. So when we write Article 6 of Paris Climate Deal, we say it relates to development of market and non-market mechanisms or approaches to mitigation of greenhouse emissions. Now the issue of framing of rules for setting up new carbon market under the Paris Climate Deal was deferred entirely to next year. Failure number 1. Then compensation for loss and damage has also been defined. There is a demand for compensation for the losses that the developing countries incur due to changes in climate. However, there was no agreement on this issue as well due to resistance from developed countries, principally by US. Failure number 2. Enhanced action. There was expectation from all countries to increase their climate actions in view of recent scientific assessments that show that the world was not doing enough to prevent the extreme impacts of climate change. But such demands were resisted mainly by big developing countries like China and India, which had been arguing that the countries be asked to deliver on their past and current promises before being asked to make new commitments. Failure number 3. So you can see that the main issues on which the countries failed but were very important in our achievements of climate action have been not only defined, but the causes of such failures have also been given. And hence that is the most crucial aspect of your answer, because it asks you to throw light that UN climate talks are failing to address the urgency of the crisis. So urgency of the crisis was addressed in introduction and their failure was addressed in the body part. And finally comes the conclusion part, and here we have started with so we can see that, which means that whatever we were asked to analyze critically, we have demonstrated that. And what we have done is that we have shown that talks are still not able to resolve the differences over rules for implementation of Paris Climate Agreement, reflecting the failure of the global community to perceive the threats posed by climate change, which was also the first statement. So finally, now it's time to put our own sample answer to the test. Now there are 3 major criteria on which the answer can be judged. The first is the structure, whether the aspirant has written introduction, body and conclusion or not. And as you can see in this particular answer, all 3 parts were addressed. The intro used relevant data, which was IPCC report. Then body addressed how the talks have failed, and the conclusion also substantiated that indeed UN talks have failed to address the climate action. Then as far as the presentation is concerned, it consists of 3 important ingredients. Number 1 is that your answer should preferably in subheading part. Now if you remember our body part, it contained 3 subheadings for 3 separate concepts. The keywords were clearly explained, and in this particular answer the diagram was not needed and hence it was not drawn. As far as language is concerned, preferably it should be simple and should use short sentences. Finally, the answer was within 270 words, which is within the tolerance limit of 10%, considering the fact that word limit was 250 words. So the aspects covered in this particular video are applicable to the answer writing overall.